morning.
Good morning.
The talk I'm giving today is entitled The Expounding of the Dharma by Non-Sentient Beings. The notion of mujo seppo. The second term in this phrase, seppo, is composed of two characters, sets meaning to expound or preach, and ho, meaning dharma. The compound of setsu and ho gives Japanese seppo. The first term, mujo, is composed of mu, a negative particle, and jo, meaning feeling, emotion, or sympathy. Its opposite is ujo, where u means having. So ujo generally means the sentient or sentient beings. That is, those having feeling or emotion. And mujo, its opposite, is the non-sentient or non-sentient beings, those devoid of feeling. Nishijima and Cross, in their translation of Dogen's fascicle Mujo Seppo, often render the term in English as the non-emotional. And in a footnote, they explain the term as referring to the state without emotion or reality that is beyond emotion. They give the example of trees, rocks, fences, walls, and so forth. It seems to me another way to understand this notion of non-sentience or non-emotional would be as beings or the state that is dispassionate, devoid of distorting emotional attachments or entanglements, like attractions and aversions, that to one extent or another deform reality. Or beings or a state that is not under the sway of the three poisons, for example. And so the full phrase mujo seppo means that inanimate things like rocks, walls, and such preach the Dharma. I found just this morning, I happened to find on the internet a translation of Dogen's fascicle entitled Mujo Seppo, a very interesting, I think a very useful translator's introduction. They translate his title Mujo Seppo as on the Dharma that non-sentient beings express. And the translator's introduction reads as follows. As Dogen's discourse makes clear, he understands sentient and non-sentient in a specific way. Sentient beings are those who are still wedded to their senses, which give rise to the duality of self and other. That is, they are those who are ordinary, worldly human beings. Non-sentient beings refers to whatever exists just as it is, which includes not only such things in nature as trees, rivers, mountains, and stones, but also those beings who have dropped off the false self, who have escaped from the tyranny of their greeds, hatreds, and delusions, and who have freed themselves from slavery to their senses. That is, they have become such a person, or we might rephrase that, a person of suchness. Nishijima and Cross, in their introduction to Dogen's essay, provide some useful perspective on the notion as well. They write, Master Dogen's usage of the word mujo was wider than the usual usage, as if the words cover the whole of nature, human beings as well as mountains, rivers, and so on. Master Dogen insisted that even inanimate things can preach the Dharma. And at the same time, he insisted that human beings can preach the Dharma when they are not emotional. He insisted that anything that is not emotional can preach the Dharma, a viewpoint that profoundly expresses the true nature of Buddhist teaching. I've been recently reading Seigen Dan Layton's book called Just This Is It. It's a study on Dongshan or Tozan's teachings, and he provides a lot of interesting background on this notion of Mujo Seppo. He writes in his book, let's see, sorry, I'll just read it, it's easier. Seigen Dan Layton, in his book, Just This Is It, on Master Dogen's practice of suchness, provides some historical background to the development of the notion of non-sentient beings' relation to the Dharma. The early Chinese Buddhist teaching of Buddha nature describes the potential for awakening in beings. This potential came to be presented as an aspect of the very nature of reality itself. As Layton writes, a century before Master Dongshan, the Tiantai school scholar Zhanran, who lived between 711 and 782, articulated the teaching potential of grasses and trees, traditionally seen as inanimate and thus inactive objects. Another Chinese scholar, Ji Zhang, had argued that the distinction between sentient and non-sentient was false or empty and not viable. Ji Zhang's view was that if we deny the Buddha nature in anything whatsoever, then not only are grasses and trees devoid of Buddha nature, but living beings are also devoid of Buddha nature. A contemporary modern Buddhist scholar named Robert Sharf believes that the rise of the teaching of Mujo Seppo was most likely a characteristically Chinese development. He writes, I do not know of any Indian references to mundane objects such as roof tiles or stones becoming Buddhas and preaching the Dharma. In other words, the extension of Buddha nature to the insentient appears to have been a distinctively Chinese innovation. We will see that the concern with the teaching of Mujo Seppo became central in the teaching and practice of Dongshan Liangjie. In Japanese, his name is Tozan. He's the master recognized traditionally as the founder of Soto Zen. Seigen Layton's comments on the centrality of Mujo Seppo in Dongshan's tradition, Seigen Layton comments on the centrality of Mujo Seppo in Dongshan's tradition, saying, a central inference of the discussion of non-sentient beings expounding the Dharma presented in Dongshan's stories is the limitation and the ultimate inaccuracy of usual conventional human notions of sentient and insentient, and of all human awareness generally. But the wonder and splendor of the suchness of the phenomenal world we inhabit is also celebrated, with important consequences for how to see and practice in this world. So for Tozan, it's the distinction between sentient and insentient that we have as human beings is very arbitrary, very anthropocentric, we could say. So he was very skeptical of this kind of distinction between sentient and non-sentient. The next section, I'd like to talk about Dongshan's Dharma inquiry regarding Mujo Seppo. From the Zen literature, it's clear that the notion of Mujo Seppo weighed quite heavily in Dongshan's Buddhist practice. He was keenly aware of a famous recorded exchange that had occurred a number of decades earlier between Master Nanyang Huizhong, who died in 776, and one of his monks. Master Nanyang, who was an important disciple of the sixth ancestor Huinong, was known posthumously as the national teacher. Dongshan, at that point in his life practicing under Guishan, another renowned Shan master of the time, brought up with Guishan his perplexity over this historical dialogue between the national teacher and his disciple. Here's the account of the dialogue as given by Dogen in his fascicle, and I'm using Nishijima and Cross's translation. National Master Daisho of Kotakuji Temple in the western capital, which is modern-day Luoyang, China, in Great Kingdom of Tang, the story goes, is asked by a monk, can the insentient really preach the Dharma or not? The national master says, they are always preaching ardently. They preach without interval. The monk says, why do I not hear it? The national master says, whether or not you hear it yourself, you should not disturb others who do hear it. The monk says, I wonder what kind of person is able to hear it. The national master says, saints are able to hear it. The monk says, does the master hear it or not? The national master says, I do not hear it. The monk says, if the master himself does not hear it, how does he know that the insentient preach the Dharma? The national master says, it is convenient that I do not hear it. If I heard it, I would be on the level of the saints, and then you would not be able to hear my preaching the Dharma. The monk says, so living beings are without the means to hear it. The national master says, I preach for living beings. I do not preach for saints. The monk says, what are living beings like after they hear? The national master says, at that time they are beyond living beings. It's very interesting, I think, what the national master says here about when he says, if the master himself does not hear it, he says, it is convenient that I do not hear it. If I heard it, I would be on the level of the saints, and then you would not be able to hear my preaching the Dharma. I think this is a very good example of the Mahayana emphasis on returning to samsara, remaining in samsara, and not going to nirvana. A slightly different version of the dialogue appears in Keizan's Denkoroku, and I'm using here Francis Dogen Koch's translation, Transmitting the Light. I quote it here. Dongshan studied with Guishan, and he asked him, lately I hear that the national teacher, Huizhong of Nanyang, has a saying about the non-sentient preaching the Dharma, but I still don't grasp its subtleties. Guishan asked, do you remember it? Dongshan said, yes, I remember it. Guishan said, well then, give it a try. Dongshan said, a monk asked, what is the mind of the ancient Buddhas? The national teacher said, fences, walls, roof tiles, and pebbles. The monk asked, aren't those all non-sentient? The national teacher said, they are. The monk asked, will you explain how they preach the Dharma? The national teacher said, they constantly preach, vigorously, without ceasing. The monk asked, why can't I hear it? The national teacher replied, you don't hear it, but that doesn't stop others from hearing it. The monk asked, I wonder if anyone else can hear it. The national teacher said, the holy ones can hear it. The monk asked, can you hear it? The national teacher replied, I can't hear it. The monk asked, if you can't hear it, how do you know that the non-sentient preach the Dharma? The national teacher answered, fortunately, I can't hear it. If I did hear it, I would be the same as the holy ones, and then you would not be able to hear me preach the Dharma. The monk asked, then do sentient beings have no part in it? The national teacher said, I preach it for the sake of sentient beings, not for holy people. The monk asked, after sentient beings hear it, then what? The national teacher said, then they are no longer sentient beings. The monk asked, what is the scriptural basis for the preaching of the Dharma by the non-sentient? The national teacher replied, don't you know that the Avatamsaka Sutra says, worlds teach, sentient beings teach, and all things of the past, present, and future teach. After recounting the dialogue to Guishan, Dongshan said to him, it is still not clear to me. I beg you to instruct me. Guishan raised his hosu, fly whisk, and asked, do you understand? Dongshan replied, no, I don't. Please explain. Guishan said, I can't explain it to you in words. Dongshan asked, is there someone else who sought the way when you did? Guishan said, if you go to the stone cave in Liling in Yoshian, you will find someone named Yunyan. If you stir up the grass and gaze into the wind, you will certainly be welcome. So this was Keizan's version of the exchange. So at this point, Dongshan, failing to understand Guishan's response in the form of his raising the fly whisk, remained perplexed about the whole matter of Mujo Seppo. Seigen Leighton provides a bit more detail and interesting perspective about the critical juncture in Dongshan's Dharma inquiry. He writes, when Dongshan failed to understand and asked for further explanation, Guishan proclaimed, it can never be explained to you by means of one born of mother and father. In other words, it can't be explained by a human being. Dongshan would later refer to such non-explanation with deep appreciation, even though he seems to be grasping for clear elucidation at this point in his life. Guishan finally suggested that Dongshan visit the teacher Yunyan for further illumination on this question. This point about non-explanation is very important in Dongshan's teaching. As I mentioned, I've been reading Daniel Leighton's book, and he makes the point that for Dongshan, actually later in his life, Dongshan was asked by his disciples, Master, why do you venerate your teacher Yunyan so much? And Dongshan replied, because he never explained anything to me. It's an interesting attitude. Right? In other words, he didn't give me a set, a cut and dried answer. And for Dongshan, it was important for each individual to find their answer. He said, you cannot get it from someone else. At this point, we resume the account given in Keizan's Tenkoroku. So Dongshan ended by leaving Guishan and going straight to Yunyan. When he finished telling the story of his dialogue with Guishan, he asked, who can hear the non-sentient preach the Dharma? So he's asking the same question again. Yunyan said, the non-sentient can hear it. Dongshan asked, can you hear it? Yunyan replied, if I heard it, you could not hear me preach the Dharma. Again, same answer that Guishan gave. Dongshan asked, why can't I hear it? Yunyan raised his hosu, fly whisk, and asked, do you hear it? Dongshan said, no, I don't hear it. And Yunyan said, if you still don't hear me preach the Dharma, how much less can you hear the non-sentient preach the Dharma? Dongshan asked, what is the scriptural basis for preaching by the non-sentient? Yunyan replied, don't you know that the Amida Sutra says streams, birds, trees all praise the Buddha and praise the Dharma. Upon hearing this, Dongshan was awakened. So in other words, he went first to Guishan and asked these kinds of questions and was totally perplexed. Then he eventually went to Yunyan and asked And at the end, somehow at the end of that exchange, he understood. The version of the same exchange between Dongshan and Yunyan, given in Dogen's fascicle, which I quote from Nishijima and Cross's translation with slight rewording, is as follows. The founding patriarch, Great Master Dongshan, while practicing under the ancestral patriarch Yunyan, asks, what people are able to hear the non-emotional preaching of Dharma? Yunyan says, the non-emotional are able to hear the non-emotional preaching of Dharma. Dongshan says, does the master hear it or not? Yunyan says, if I hear it, then you will not be able to hear my preaching of the Dharma. The Dongshan says, if that is so, I would rather not hear the master's preaching of the Dharma. Yunyan says, you do not even hear me preaching the Dharma. How much less do you hear the non-emotional preaching of the Dharma? Then the founding patriarch Dongshan sets forth the following verse and presents it to Yunyan. So apparently he had some understanding at that point and wrote a poem and presented it to his teacher kind of as his statement, as his expression of his understanding. And here's the poem he wrote. How very wonderful, how very wonderful. The non-emotional preaching the Dharma is a mystery. If we listen with the ears, it is ultimately too difficult to understand. If we hear the sound through the eyes, we are able to know it. Very interesting kind of expression, sort of this notion that you sort of can hear through the eyes. Seigen Leighton offers some interesting observation regarding Dongshan's exchange with Guishan and then his exchange with Yunyan, and the similarity of their gestures, with raising the fly wrist. He writes, although there is no indication of any communication between Guishan and Yunyan, aside from the person of Dongshan inquiring before them, Yunyan intriguingly performed the same action as Guishan. So Guishan raised the fly wrist, and then later Yunyan did the same thing, raised the fly wrist. Rather than seeing this as an example of mystical accord or extrasensory perception between Guishan and Yunyan, this exemplifies simply using what was at hand, literally at hand, it was close to hand. Such fly whisks were symbols of teaching authority and Dharma, commonly carried by Chan masters. But more directly, the whisk was the conventionally inanimate object most immediately at hand. If all non-sentient beings proclaimed the Dharma, there was no need to look further. In other words, any non-sentient being, anything, any Dharma can preach the Buddha's teaching, and so the fly whisk was the most handy thing to use. At this point, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about some references to Mujo Seppo and Dogen's Bendowa. We find Dogen mentioning this teaching of Mujo Seppo repeatedly in his Bendowa, a very fundamental text about Zen practice realization, written in 1231. This was fairly early in Dogen's life, and a few years after his return to Japan from China. A few pages into the work, we find this passage. I think I need to read it. Listen to my time here. So he writes, there is a path through which the Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, unexcelled complete enlightenment, of all things, returns to the person in Zazen, and whereby that person, and the enlightenment of all things intimately and imperceptibly assist each other. Therefore, this Zazen person without fail drops off body and mind, cuts away previous tainted views and thoughts, awakens genuine Buddha Dharma, universally helps the Buddha work in each place, as numerous as atoms, where Buddha Tathagatas teach and practice, and widely influences practitioners who are going beyond Buddha, thereby vigorously exalting the Dharma that goes beyond Buddha. And here's the really relevant passage. He says, at this time, because earth, grasses and trees, fences and walls, tiles and pebbles, all things in the Dharma realm in 10 directions, carry out Buddha work, everyone thereby receives the benefit of wind and water movement caused by this functioning, and all are imperceptibly helped by the wondrous and incomprehensible influence of Buddha to actualize the enlightenment at hand. Here, Dogen is explaining the merit and the dynamics of Zazen practice, and the mutual assistance that operates among practitioners and all things in the universe, including non-sentient objects. He says that the practitioner and all things intimately and imperceptibly assist one another. He also states that the earth and all things, we could read that as Mujo Seppo, carry out Buddha work. In other words, they preach the Dharma. Dogen is referring here, of course, to the total dynamic functioning, or Zen Ki, of cosmic interdependence. This passage from the Bendowa may remind us of his sentence also from the Genjo Koan that says, all things coming and carrying out practice enlightenment through the self is realization. All things here seems clearly to include Mujo, the non-sentient, although Dogen likely means here to include Ujo, sentient beings, as well. In his Genjo Koan, Dogen contrasts this realization with delusion when he writes, conveying oneself toward all things to carry out practice realization is delusion. This is a very central, very core passage in his Genjo Koan. He's making the distinction between if we try to somehow promote the self, the personal self, the ego, toward all things, that's delusion. But if, in other words, if all things kind of come to us and we kind of flow through us, then that is realization. It's a difference in orientation. A little bit further on in the Bendowa, Dogen writes, moreover, although both mind and object, we could read that as subject and object, appear and disappear within stillness, we could read that as Zazen, because this takes place in the realm of self-receiving and self-employing, Ji-Juyu, without moving a speck of dust or destroying a single form, extensive Buddha work and profound, subtle Buddha influence are carried out. And here again is the relevant passage. The grass, trees, and earth affected by this functioning radiate great brilliance together and endlessly expound the deep, wondrous Dharma. Grasses and trees, fences and walls demonstrate and exalt it for the sake of living beings, both ordinary and sage. And in turn, living beings, both ordinary and sage, express and unfold it for the sake of grasses and trees, fences and walls. In commenting on this sentence, the grasses, trees, and earth affected by this functioning radiate great brilliance together and endlessly expound the deep, wondrous Dharma, Uchiyama comments in these words. He says, "The grass, trees, and the land, all things in nature itself, are the reality of life that is at peace and ease beyond discrimination. To radiate a great light means to be at peace and ease within the self that is only the self. There are some human beings who become neurotic and have a warped mind. They become timid when they are treated harshly in the world of success and failure. When we practice Zazen, we are at peace and ease, as the self that is only the self is beyond success and failure. Then we radiate a great light and express the profound and wondrous Dharma." Among Uchiyama's commentaries on the remainder of Dogen's quotation, he says, "When we sit in Zazen facing the trunk of a tree or a wall, even though delusions arise, once we go back to Zazen and let go of thoughts, the illusions disappear. Only the tree or the wall remains." And then a little bit further in those comments, he says, "I feel very good when I walk looking up at the sky. The sky is something wondrous. There is no pattern. It is the same as a wall. Each cloud has a different form. Only when I look up at the sky does it preach that there is a world in which we do not need to be excited." I kind of read that as a reference to that notion of the non-emotional. There's a world where we do not need to be excited. The sky expounds and exalts this for living beings, and that which makes nature the Buddha Dharma is Zazen. Therefore, living beings expound and exalt this for grass, trees, and fences. At this point, I'd like to present a poem by Daichi Soken on the theme of Mujo Seppo and read some commentary on it. First of all, I'd like to introduce the poet. His name is Daichi Soken. He lived between 1290 and 1366. He became a monk under Kangan Gien, a disciple of Dogen, and after Kangan's death, he visited various teachers. Later on, he practiced with Keizan Zenji, the fourth successor of Dogen, for 7 years. At the age of 25, he left on a trip that took him to China and Korea, staying there on the mainland for 11 years. So in a sense, he almost echoed what Dogen did. He was Japanese, and he made a trip to China, and he also went to Korea, but it's also what Dogen did. In Yuan Dynasty China, his literary works purportedly drew much enthusiastic attention. After returning to Japan in 1325, he received Zen transmission from Meiho Sotetsu, the first and chief disciple of Keizan, and he supposedly received the transmission on the recommendation of Keizan. Keizan, if you're not familiar, is one of the very important promoters of Soto Zen. He lived several generations after Dogen, but he very much expanded and promoted Soto practice. Dogen's practice was more self-contained, was a little bit more hermetic in the sense that, but Keizan really made it popular among the ordinary people. Anyhow, getting back to Daichi, it is said that soon after returning to Japan from China and Korea, Daichi paid a visit to Keizan at Ekoji, also known as Yokoji, a temple near the sea in Noto province. And this temple was founded by Keizan and was his main place of practice during his lifetime, as well as his eventual burial place. Seigen was delighted with Daichi's visit, and a brief dialogue, or mondo, between the two Zen monks is recorded. Seigen asked, "What do you think as a child who is seeing his parents again after such a long journey?" "In front of the true mirror, there's no need for light," replied Daichi. "If there's no light, there's no image in the mirror," said Seigen. "It's possible to see, but we can't know anything about the future," replied Daichi. Thereupon, Master Seigen affirmed, "You surely belong to our lineage." It's a sort of an enigmatic dialogue having to do with light and darkness. Generally in the Zen perspective, or the Buddhist perspective, darkness refers to the realm of total oneness, and light refers to the realm where things are differentiated. Forms have specific shape and color. So it's a very sort of poetic dialogue, but it revolves around that point. Soon after this pleasant reunion, Seigen was to pass away. As for Daichi, he went on to found the temple Gidaiji in Kaga, and to become abbot of Kofukuji in Hyugo, Kyushu. Most of his last years he spent at a lovely mountain retreat, which served to nourish his poetic inspirations. In the history of Japanese Zen, he is regarded as one of the greatest poets. Among the many poems composed by Daichi during his lifetime, there is one, poem number 19, entitled Mujo Seppo no Wa. It's translated Preaching of the Dharma by Non-Sentient Objects. It's on the topic we are examining here today. Like most of Daichi's poems, it conveys very simple but evocative images. I actually see it. This was a calligraphy of that poem by my original teacher, Tyson Bishimaru. So this is the text of the poem that I'm going to be reading and commenting on here now. So the poem reads as follows. Non-sentient objects hear it. The wind stirs up disorder in the cold forest, and leaves fill the courtyard. Even if there's nobody there, the stone wall has ears. Stone lanterns and pillars, please, for just one brief moment, don't raise your voices. For the remainder of the talk, I'd like to present Tyson Bishimaru's commentaries on this poem. He begins his comments saying, "This poem is a koan." It's a poem alluding to a famous mondo between the Chinese master Yunyang and his disciple Dongshan, known in Japanese as Tozan. And Tozan was also the originator of the Soto Zen lineage, and is reputed to be the author of the Hokkyo Zanmai. That poem is a very important poem in the Soto tradition. It's translated usually as the jewel mirror samadhi, or the precious mirror samadhi. Continuing the commentaries. Mujo Seppo, the term in the title of the poem, is the teaching of the Buddha's Dharma by non-sentient objects, such as trees, flowers, mountains, and rivers. We can hear nature. Objects can offer us a teaching here and now. The history of Zen is full of accounts of those aspiring to the way who achieved satori upon hearing the sounds of nature, a gust of wind, a murmuring brook, a pebble hitting a bamboo stalk. So all of the phenomena that arise on earth are capable of expounding the Buddha's teaching. Dongshan once asked his master Yunyan, this is not going to be new, we've heard this a couple times already, who can hear Mujo Seppo, the teaching of non-sentient objects? Master Yunyan replied, only non-sentient things can hear the preaching of non-sentient things. Dongshan posed another question. Have you heard or experienced it? Yunyan gave a curious reply. If I could hear it, you wouldn't be able to hear it. In other words, I'm Mujo Seppo, so you aren't able to hear my non-sentient being Dharma preaching. For Dongshan the disciple, this was not at all clear, and he asked Yunyan the same question again. Yunyan answered, have you perhaps understood? Some have realized Satori and understand. The disciple Dongshan remained unperturbed. I can't hear any teaching, he said. To this, Yunyan said, if you can't even hear my teaching, how could you hear Mujo Seppo? At that moment, Dongshan understood. He did triple prostration, sampai, in front of his teacher and composed this poem for him. This is a slightly different version of the poem. It's close, but a little bit different. Wondrous, rare Mujo Seppo. I cannot explain it. Even if you listen to my voice, you cannot hear it. This preaching of non-sentient things can only be understood by non-sentient things. One who attains awakening is sensitive to it. When we are not listening to Mujo Seppo, we can hear it. It is just like this during Zazen. Dogen, in his Sansho Doe, translated usually as Songs of the Parasol Time, a collection of poems addressed to a lay disciple of his and written to explain the inexpressible dimension of Zazen, wrote, the color of mountains, the sound of a valley, this is all the voice and the posture of my beloved Buddha Shakyamuni. The color of a mountain, the sound of a valley, river or stream, the chirping of birds, moonlight, all of this is Buddha. Everything is the voice of Buddha. It's kind of interesting here. In a sense, he's talking about sounds, and also things that are visible, like the color of a mountain and the moonlight. But he says all of it is the voice of Buddha. In Chinese and Japanese, there are two different characters for hearing. When we take in sound unconsciously, it's called in Japanese mon. When we listen attentively and with effort, it's cho. Hearing a lecture is called cho mon. And he continues, I need to interject here a little bit of background. When I was practicing with Master Deshima in France, in his Sangha, he would deliver the teaching while people were seated in Zazen. So it was not like here, where we have sort of a casual, informal kind of Dharma talk. People would be sitting in Zazen, and he would teach at that time. And that, he would call that Husen, oral teaching. So that you sort of need to know that because he talks here about that. So that's kind of the background. So he says here, surely you do both during Zazen. At times you listen to the voice of the teacher, and at times you just hear it unconsciously and naturally. Sometimes you listen, and sometimes you tune out the voice. This is a quite important point. This preaching of non-sentient beings can only be heard by non-sentient beings. Consider the line from Dai Chi's poem, the wind stirs up disorder in the cold forest, and leaves fill the courtyard. In the sense of you, if you kind of visualize that image, it's almost like a dialogue between the wind, the trees and the leaves and the courtyard. It's almost like they're talking to one another, they're interacting and talking. It's sort of the preaching of the non-sentient beings. The next line, even if there's nobody there, the stone wall has ears. This refers to a traditional Japanese tale, and here's the storyline of the tale. A woman and her son, and I think in other versions they say a father and his son, were trespassing onto someone's watermelon patch. She asked her son, "Nobody's watching, are they?" The child replied, "But Mommy, the moon is watching. Careful." The mother was totally taken by surprise. She felt as if the moon were warning her, saying, "You shouldn't steal." The moon was not talking, and yet it was. So the mother made gasho and prostrations toward the moon and withdrew with her child. With the moon, with Buddha, we cannot lie and tell ourselves there's nobody there. In Japanese, as in English, there is a popular saying that walls have ears. Stone lanterns and pillars, please, for just one brief moment, don't raise your voices. That's the last line of the poem. Each being in nature, whether sentient or non-sentient, provides us with a teaching. During Zazen, the barking of a dog, the chirping of birds, and in some sanghas, the whack of the kyosaku, become mujo seppo, when our mind is awakened and in hishiryo. Hishiryo refers to the state of mind that Hojo-san often describes as putting the motor of the car in neutral, and the motor is idling. In other words, thoughts are occurring, but there's no action. At times, the gong and the zafus, or here in our sangha, perhaps the chairs or the sitting benches, can be too noisy. And so, for just one instant, please don't raise your voices. There's no need for excessive mujo seppo. And Deshimaru concludes his commentaries by saying, this poem is a very interesting poem. That's all I have today. Do we have time?
So, people have some questions? I just say I find very interesting the distinction about sentient beings and emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think sometimes we think, well, sentient beings have some extra wisdom or consciousness or something, therefore we expect them to actively preach in some way. But if we think about it, the sentience is about this potential for emotional hijack.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes not the better option, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that non-sentience becomes the more, I don't know, I mean, you don't want to make a distinction like good and bad, but, you know, it casts that whole relationship in a very interesting way that I think really helps us as human beings in this kind of practice with that.
Mm-hmm.
How do we practice with that? It's an interesting question for us, I think.
Yeah, in fact, one of those, I don't know which one it was, whether it was Nishijima or one of the kind of introduction to Dogen's thing, they talk about how, in a sense, non-sentient beings are just as they are. They're just the way they are. There's no interference. There's no static. And so, in a sense, we're the ones who are at the disadvantage. We sentient people are at the disadvantage.
Did I understand correctly that a human being can become non-sentient?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is,
Yeah.
I have never thought like that.
Yeah.
One of the other things that is coming up from your talk is the distinction between animate and inanimate beings. I had always assumed animate and being linked together, but to consider a rock as a being that is inanimate.
Mm-hmm.
It's another unique thing.
Yeah, I think really in a sense, the bottom line here is to sort of kind of drop off this distinction between, what's sentient and what's animate and what's inanimate. it's a very artificial distinction that we make. We human beings make it because of our brain.
I was wondering if you think that animism can carry the Japanese culture to some role in the idea of inanimate objects
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very, very clear. Yeah, very much so. Maybe someone from Japan would like to say something about that. I'm not that familiar with Shintoism. And I think the notion that, it's very, very much in tune with this teaching, that all things in nature, water, streams, rivers, clouds, sky, everything. In a sense, when we think about the sky or these things, we have distinctions. We make distinctions. This is not a human being, so somehow it's not as valuable. We make a value judgment when we talk about rivers or trees or grasses or whatever.
Would you mind reading again what this young Roshi said about looking at the sky?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very beautiful. I had never really thought of, we often talk about looking at the wall, or looking at the tree trunk. Originally, I think it was the tree trunk, and how, we try to have something that doesn't have form. We want something that's not patterned. And the sky is like that. I mean, it's the blue sky, it has clouds floating through it, but it's formless in a sense. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. He says, I feel very good when I walk looking up at the sky. The sky is something wondrous. There is no pattern. It is the same as a wall. Each cloud has a different form, and only when I look up at the sky does it preach that there is a world in which we do not need to be excited. The sky expounds and exalts this for living beings, and that which makes nature the Buddha Dharma is Zazen. Therefore, living beings expound and exalt this for grass, trees, and fences.
What struck me about that is when he said, I feel very good when I look at the sky is wondrous. I identify with that totally, and that's how I feel about much of nature. I think it's wondrous, and I feel the wonder of it. But then he goes on to say, even though he's saying it's wondrous, he's saying he's not excited. And to me, often the experience of nature, that wondrous experience, is exciting.
I don't know if that's excitement. Maybe it's joy. I think joy and excitement might be different in a way.
But it seems he's talking maybe about this stillness or absence of emotion, whereas for me, a lot of times my experience of nature is emotion. So that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah.
This idea of non-sentient beings, say, being really important.
I'm sorry?
Being really important, not just preaching the Dharma, but sort of non-sentient beings, rather than saying, oh, that's a cutting board, or that's a...
Yeah. And we often say that's just a cutting board.
Yeah,
And
it's not important.
Sort of dismissing it.
To read that. And also streams and the land and everything that. To me that seems to match just an idea that I picked up from reading about some, that we should be very respectful of everything that we use, chairs, whatever, and take care of everything. The utensils we use in the kitchen, keep everything clean. Is that?
Yeah, I think totally.
It seems to all be
part of beyond philosophy.
Yeah, in a way, I mean, this particular teaching, I think, really contributes to a sense of ecology, modern, our modern awareness of ecology and the whole, the balance of nature,
That
and
everything
respecting.
is interconnected.
And I think that's the whole point, that interconnected, the Zen key that Dharma talks about, total dynamic function, Zen key, interdependence.
Some of your topics made me think a little bit about Ralph Waldo Emerson. He had this famous essay on nature. And sort of through the whole process of it, he sort of ends up at this idea that everything in nature is, in a way, preaching to us. But his idea, I think, was informed by Christianity. So that I think at one time it says the Ten Commandments resound through all of nature. And that idea sort of doesn't totally sit well with me. That it seems to be a sort of human projection onto nature, whereas this seems to be something a little bit different. So I wonder if you could just maybe not having read it, but
Yeah, I think an important point here with this teaching is also connected with suchness, the notion of suchness, in the sense that things as they are, respecting things as they are, and things as they are teaching, are preaching. Whereas in the case of maybe saying that there's some kind of commandment or something, that's a concept. It's something, a notion that we're somehow projecting onto reality. The important thing, at least in the Soto teaching, is that actually in all of Buddhism, suchness, things as they are, being at one with the total interdependence. In a sense, it's beyond any kind of conceptual or some kind of framework, some kind of conceptual framework that we lay over reality. It's maybe the best I can do with that question.
One aspect of this could be maybe is that we're flipped over. It's independent of any of these concepts like Ten Commandments or but the flip on that is it includes everything. You want to go with the Ten Commandments,
Yeah.
that's fine. You're fine just as well. If you want to go along with whatever it is, the 5 this or the 9 that, that's wonderful. You got it. But, you know what I'm trying to say? It includes. So, in a sense, I think that there's nothing in common.
Yeah, that kind of brings up the point sort of about this dialogue between the national teacher and the disciple that he says if the disciple seems so intent on hearing the non-sentient beings speaking, and yet he's a sentient being, and so the teacher is saying, okay, but I teach for sentient beings. I teach for people who are troubled by these concepts, who have brains, who create all these concepts and distinctions. And so, in a sense, he's saying, if I were there just enjoying, the preaching of the non-sentient beings, you would not be hearing the Dharma to help you in the sentient world. And it's sort of that bodhisattva vow, coming back to samsara and remaining here and helping sentient beings who also have trouble because of their concepts and final distinctions.
Just wanted to respond to what you were bringing up about Walter Emerson and any taking human
concepts and imposing them on nature. That I think is very important. I think when you think about ecology, which I love the solution. And that has many people who don't understand the need to protect the environment will ask, why is a tiny little fish that's endangered important? Why should we keep the dam there and put a pipeline in there? And that viewpoint, I think, sees the entire world as existing for people. If it's not helpful to people, then that, right? Whatever you can easily see, then you don't need a little fish or and that viewpoint totally misses the interdependence of everything.
And I guess in a way that's part of our bodhisattva practice. How do we deal with people who look at the world that way? Right? How do we somehow include them? How do we help that kind of problem? Any other questions? Thank you for your attention.
These are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Illusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable,